All right, so now that we've discussed this anti-slavery, the move from emancipation to abolition, and we've discussed the women's rights movement, what I want to do now is discuss Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, that name should sound familiar. Harriet Beecher was the daughter of Lyman Beecher, the social reformer and preacher. We've already mentioned her sister, Catherine, who was a big believer in this cult of domesticity that we just discussed. Harriet Beecher was born in Connecticut, and then when her family moved to Cincinnati, she went as well, and she married a professor at Lane Seminary, where her father was the president. His name was Stowe, Calvin Stowe. He was a professor, I think, of Hebrew and Greek and the Old Testament. Now, she was a woman. She had attended a women's school. She was a highly intelligent, educated woman. And like many middle-class women, she threw herself into various reform movements. Now, she was gifted as a writer, and so she used her talents writing. She wrote pamphlets for the temperance movement. She wrote pamphlets for the Sabbatarian movement, that is the idea of making Sunday a holy day of rest and keeping the Sabbath. So she was involved. Those were movements that her father, Lyman, had been involved in the past. And she also liked to write fiction. Now, there was a very popular magazine for middle-class women called Godey's Lady Book. Harriet Beecher Stowe began to send her writings and her stories to Godey's Lady Book. Now, Godey's Lady Book its longtime editor was a woman named Sarah Hale, and it was considered to be, it set the trend for fashion for middle-class women, but also it espoused this ideal that middle-class women were more compassionate, not just middle-class women, but women in general were more compassionate, more caring, that they had a natural affinity for caring for children, that they had a duty to protect public morality and to maintain high moral standards in the community. And the book was very popular among middle-class women, and it was this book that where Harriet Beecher Stowe began to first write fictional pieces of literature. Now, by 1852 or so, 1851, when she first published Uncle Tom's Cabin, by this time period, Harriet Beecher Stowe was becoming increasingly concerned about the abolitionist movement. And one of the things that bothered her was the fact that the abolitionists were unable to get broad popular support, that there were so many Northerners who did not care about the plight of slaves. There were a couple of things that happened in her life that she found shocking. For example, in 1836, James Birney, the same person who would later be the candidate for the Liberty Party, he published a anti-slavery and abolitionist newspaper in Cincinnati, and it just incensed the public. And in 1836, a mob burned down his publishing business, drove him out of town. The next year, in 1837, another abolitionist named Elijah Lovejoy. In 1837, Elijah Lovejoy, he had opened up a abolitionist newspaper in Upton, Illinois, up north. And in 1837, there was a riot. You can see it in the image. There was a riot. Elijah Lovejoy was captured by a mob and lynched. He was killed. And this was very shocking to people who were abolitionists, people like Harriet Beecher Stowe. But then probably the biggest shock and the biggest concern of Harriet Beecher Stowe was the Compromise of 1850, some years later. The Compromise of 1850 included the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act enabled the government to take slaves who were suspected of being runaways and to capture them and send them back to slavery in the South. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she had been involved in the Underground Railroad. She was opposed to slavery, and she was very angry. Now, many other folks who were abolitionists and opposed to slavery, they also were angry. You can see from the image that in Boston, there was a broadside, a pamphlet went out, a bulletin went out asking for people to come together in a rally to oppose the fugitive slave law. And it talks about the evils of slave power. There are many abolitionists who believe that wealthy Southern slave owners were manipulating and controlling the American government to impose their evil institution on the rest of America. So the fugitive slave law really got Harriet Beecher Stowe and other abolitionists motivated to take action. And Harriet Beecher Stowe decided to take action by writing a novel. She had experience in writing. She had written fictional pieces for Lady Godey's magazine. So she decided to write a novel. And it was beginning in 1851. She published in an anti-slavery newspaper she published the novel in segments, in a serial form. And eventually in 1852, the entire novel came out, known as Uncle Tom's Cabin. You can see the first printing of it as an image. And this book, when she wrote the book, she wrote it in a form that was very popular at the time. It was called domestic. It was a genre called domestic fiction. It was very melodramatic, very sentimental. But even though she was writing in a form of a novel that was very popular at the time, the book had a very radical message, because for the first time in American literature, the central character, Uncle Tom, was an African American, and that was unheard of. So she was using a popular literary genre to send a message, a radical message to America. It would be as if somebody were to write a very popular novel like about vampires or something. The vampires seem to be like Twilight series, seems to be popular today. It would be like if somebody wrote a novel about vampires, but the central message had to do with the environment or gay rights or some controversial issue that's on people's minds today. But this book was very popular, and within a year, it sold 300,000 copies, and it was an instant bestseller. And not only was it published in America, it was translated and sold in Europe. And it was just a big bestseller. In fact, in the 19th century, it's the number one bestseller in terms of copies sold. And not only that, but it was made into a popular drama, a stage drama that was watched across the North. Now, in this novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe, like I said, the central character was an African American, Uncle Tom. And what Harriet Beecher Stowe wanted to impress on her readers was that African Americans were capable of being Christians, ideal Christians. In this novel, Uncle Tom is the idealized Christian. He's beaten, he's tortured, he's mistreated. The big villain in the book is the slave taskmaster, Simon Legree. You see an image from the book. Simon Legree, who is standing in the image, was mean, vicious person who was always mistreating and treating Uncle Tom terribly. But Uncle Tom, no matter how badly he was treated, he always had an inner peace because he had the love of the Lord in his heart. And that's the way that Harriet Beecher Stowe wanted to convey. She wanted to convey that message that African Americans were Christians and that African Americans were people, and that slavery was an institution that dehumanized and belittled people. And she wanted the reader in the North to read this novel and say to themselves, can I live with myself if my brothers and sisters in Christ are suffering that way in the South? And the book did a lot to change attitudes so that more and more Americans in the North came to believe that slavery was wrong. Now, that's not to say that they believed that African Americans were the equal of whites. Typical of the attitudes of many Northerners was somebody like Abraham Lincoln before the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, one of the reasons why he was nominated by the Republican Party in 1860 was that his public positions were in line with public opinion in the North. He viewed slavery as immoral and wrong, but he still believed in accepting slavery in the South for keeping the Union intact, and he also was a believer in colonization. He believed that blacks and whites could not live with each other at peace, and he supported colonization. He also believed that whites were superior to blacks. If anything, what Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel did was to at least convince many Americans up north that slavery was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was unchristian. And that was its greatest impact. Now, in the South, the book was viewed as a smear, as irrational, as unjust. Southerners were pointed out that Harriet Beecher Stowe had sensationalized, the situation. That, of course, there were cases where slave owners were mistreated their slaves, but they were the exception rather than the rule. That was the defense most given, the defense most offered mostly by slave owners, that somehow Harriet Beecher Stowe her book was inaccurate, that it portrayed slavery in the worst possible light, that most slave owners were not like Simon Legree. But the book had a polarizing effect on the country, with people in the North reading it, gobbling it up, reading it, buying copies of it, and more and more believing that slavery was wrong, whereas Southerners became more defensive and more angry that somehow their virtue and their Christianity was under attack. Basically, Harriet Beecher Stowe was saying that people who had slaves, were not real Christians, and that bothered Christians. There were a lot of Christians in the South who found that offensive and wrong, that Harriet Beecher would make that kind of accusation against them. So the book had a very polarizing effect. And there's a story, and some people say it's probably not true, or say that it's just a legend. But there's a story that in 1862, just before the Emancipation Proclamation was put out, that Harriet Beecher Stowe went to Washington to meet President Lincoln to urge him to emancipate the slaves, to liberate the slaves. And when Abraham Lincoln met her at the White House, he supposedly said, "So this is the little woman who made this big war." Now, that story probably came about because from the very beginning, at least by the time of the American Civil War, it became clear that Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe had a major impact on the nation, and maybe was not the factor, but was a major factor in the events leading to the American Civil War.